Hello, welcome. This is one of a series of short videos that we've put together at Griffith University in the School of Environment and the Environment Futures Research Institute to help students who are thinking about doing their PhDs a series of published and unpublished papers. And my name is Professor Catherine Pickering at Griffith University. Now, why I'm talking to you about this is because I've had experience of working with students, my own students who've gone on to publish papers and then use those papers within their PhD. But I'm also the higher research degree convener in the School of Environment on the Gold Coast. So I actually also work with a range of PhD students more broadly who've used this type of structure and format. In addition to that, I've published a large number of papers with PhD students, honours students and undergraduates. So worked with them around the challenges of having to publish. And we all know there are lots of benefits, but there are also a few challenges out there. Now, there are different types of PhD theses accepted within the sciences group at Griffith University and often within the sciences in different universities around the world. And we've got a variety of examples here that I'm going to start out by illustrating how students have gone ahead and put papers into their PhD and the different types of structures. So there's a range of students who have actually in the end included the PDF of the papers in the version that's gone out for examination. There are others who've used the pre-publication version of papers that have been accepted and or in review and have that in their thesis. And then a third one is what we call a hybrid format. And that's where parts of the thesis have been published as papers, but what they've done is turned those papers back into looking more like traditional thesis chapters. So in this case, an examiner reading it could be looking at it as a traditional thesis format, but is aware that several parts of it have then been published as well. And finally, there's a traditional format where some papers have been published prior to submission, but they haven't specifically indicated or linked directly the chapters to the papers. And this is what some of them look like. So this is Dr. William Bennett, and in his case, he included the PDF of 5 published papers as the results chapters in his thesis. So he had a general introduction chapter, then he had these 5 PDFs, and then he had a general discussion chapter. Here's another student, Dr. Mark Runkalski. In his case, he included PDFs of 6 published papers as the results chapters. Yet again, he had a general introduction setting the scene. Then the major part of the thesis consisted of the PDFs of the papers and then a discussion chapter. Same for Michael Ansong, same type of thing, looking at that structure. And these are the statements that they've included in the front of their thesis, letting people know about that structure. Here's another one which included some PDFs of published papers, but also some that were in review, where they were indicating the student, Dr. Rochelle Stevens, who's now got her PhD and all the papers are published. But at the time, some of them were in review. So it doesn't have to just be published papers, it can also be papers that are in review. And then here's this one I talked about where it was pre-publication versions of accepted and in review papers. And this is the statement that she had associated with that, indicating what the chapters were, which ones were published, and which ones were in review. And here's this one I talked about as the hybrid format, which is where they had statement in the beginning saying research published during the PhD, listing a whole range of publications, but also conference papers, etc., to make it clear that a whole lot of the work has been published. So the first thing is, why should you think about doing your PhD this way? Well, earlier in the PhD, the better you do it, because the benefits of it are huge. And my PhD students keep telling me I should really promote this method because they've found it incredibly beneficial. But I will also be talking about some of the problems. The more you do it and the earlier you do it, you get more experience at writing in this form. And remember, publishing papers in many science disciplines is still the most common method of exchanging your information. The earlier you start also, the more time you get for the review process to occur. And this is critically important because once you've got reviewers' comments back, and particularly where you've been able to incorporate those changes and then have the paper accepted, then that paper has benefited from that input of all of those people and is a really high quality product. Now, if you get your paper submitted earlier, you've got more chance to get that as a reviewer's comments, whereas if it's all toward the end, you haven't had necessarily that benefit. And one of the things that we've found is that where you have papers that are in review and you've submitted the final thesis, the comments you get back from the examiners of the thesis often resemble the comments you're getting back from the reviewers. So it saves you time to be able to have those comments earlier, incorporate those changes and improve the quality of the papers and the thesis. Of course, associated with that is getting more feedback from the reviewers before the thesis is submitted, and the other is more of your chapters consist of published and accepted papers or submitted papers. So starting early is really useful if you can. Now, if you're going to use this strategy wherever you are, one of the critical things is to make sure that it's consistent with the policy of your institution. So here at Griffith University, they have an explicit statement of the policy, and it changes every so often as it gets improved and formatted as this becomes a more common methodology. So the critical thing is go check the current strategy and policy in your institution, and if it's a Griffith, this is where the link is at the moment, but you can always go onto the websites and you'll see the links through there. Now, the benefits is that preparing papers for publication save times when preparing the thesis, as papers can make up one or more chapters. It's an advantage to publish your work from the thesis as a means of disseminating your results. And this is really important because it's really nice not to feel isolated and you're doing all this work and you're all on your own. If you start to publish and you get people knowing you about your papers, citing your papers, reading your papers, following up with you, it's a fantastic way to feel part of a community because we end up being parts of research communities. And it's really important for PhD students to start to feel that what they're doing is more than just about them. It's also about this broader research community. Of course, it improves the quality of the thesis as parts have already been subject to peer review. The examiners may have more confidence if they can see it's already published, and we've found that that's happened where there have been PDFs of papers. Often, not always, but generally, examiners sit there and go, fine, those are really nice, I'll read them, but they tend to provide very few comments for those. They concentrate on the introduction and discussion. It also meets one of the criteria that in some institutions have for examination with the thesis that the thesis is suitable for publication. If you've already demonstrated that, then you're already ahead. And also, at our institution, doctoral candidates are expected to at least one peer-reviewed output, except for publication during their candidature. So this is, again, a requirement to encourage people to start to do it and do it early. So again, the earlier you start, the benefits, you fulfil this requirement. Now, in our university, there's some rules about the criteria and rules for what papers can and can't be introduced and what we're talking about when we say paper. So it can be published or unpublished papers, must be produced under supervision and during the candidature. The quality of the papers is appropriate to the level of research. And by papers, they're meaning journal articles, conference publications, book or book chapters, because that varies amongst the discipline areas. Now, in my discipline area, environmental science, which includes chemistry, it includes marine biology, terrestrial ecology, a whole lot of discipline areas like that. It's mainly international referee journal papers, but others, it can be other different components of what we talk about by papers. Second thing that's really important is the student needs to be demonstrating their contribution. And so at our institution, we talk about students would normally be the principal author that is responsible for the intellectual content and the majority of the writing of the text. And I'm going to come to some issues around that in different discipline areas where co-authorship may not be common, or the reverse, when lots of authors are quite common on papers. But for the paper to be part of your thesis and included in your thesis, the assumption is that you're the first author, and there has to be a really good reason for an exception to that. So have a think about that. So we're jointly authored, so not just you, your first author, but there are others. A signature from the corresponding author is required in order to include the material in the thesis. And again, with co-authored work in which the student was a minor author, they can only be used and referenced in the way common to any other research publication cited in the thesis, i.e. you can cite them, but they can't be a major or component or a chapter in the thesis. Now, going back a step, there's some really good papers out there to let you know how examiners examine PhD theses. And this is a fantastic one that I strongly recommend. It's called It's a PhD, Not a Nobel Prize. And it's about how experienced examiners assess research theses. Because it's really important when you're structuring the thesis to think how is the examiner actually going to read it? How are they going to sit down and engage with that material? And this paper found that they tend to spend 3 to 4 days full time doing it, but it's spread out over 2 to 3 weeks. they're quite reluctant to fail the thesis, and in the end, in the final version, even after having, in some cases, required additional material, less than 3% or around 3% are considered a fail. But what your issue is, are you going to be required to do major changes, minor changes, or no changes? You want that thesis over, and you want to get nice and clear of that boundary. Most read the abstract, introduction, and final chapter, check the references, then go back and read it cover to cover. So when you're structuring it, you should think about that's how they're going to approach it. They're not going to sit down generally and read it from the beginning to end. They're going to start with that abstract, introduction, final chapter, then come back to read the rest in detail. First impressions count, so it's really important to get rid of the typos, make it beautiful formatted, lovely things, title, abstract, introductory chapter, final chapter, etc., that they don't come across typos, etc. It really annoys them right up front. Publications of work is good, but must be clear what the student did. Now, as we've talked about, this is about doing PhD as published and unpublished papers. And this is becoming more common in Australia and also in New Zealand. And this is a really nice study from New Zealand that was looking at what do examiners want from a thesis consisting of papers. And they assessed 62 examiners of publication based on thesis, and they found that 48% found easy to assess, but 26% wanted more guidance from the university about the requirements. 77% want more theses like this, so they really like it. 86 were impressed by publications in international peer-reviewed journals. The higher the impact, better the better. But they were also concerned about the input of the candidate in the authored papers and the coherence of the thesis. So I'm going to go through talking about how you can put your thesis together and particularly how you can deal with those two issues highlighted. Now, they also included some recommendations about guidelines for students. So clarification on different types of publication-based thesis and format, commentary in the introduction explaining what published, where, status and authorship, recognising ethical issues with authorship and how they've resolved, and structure the thesis to present a coherent argument, commentary in the introduction, bridging sections between chapters, and synthesis. So I'm going to go through how you can do these particular. But everyone asks this question, how many papers? Well, there are no hard and fast rules. The best thing to do is to ask around and get the views. So when I've asked other academics in my discipline area, they've tended to say you need 3 papers, and I'm being conservative and, you know, bit hedging. So I think 4 is good in case the lab blows up, the field site burns down, something goes wrong. You can lose one chapter or paper doesn't work, you've still got 3. But different disciplines have different expectations. And again, discipline differences matter. So it's really worth thinking about those. So we sometimes talk about core PhD papers, the 3 or 4 that are going to go in the PhD. Sometimes you might find you've got some interesting side material that might end up being a side PhD paper. And then of course there's the other thing is that post-PhD paper. Very often people end up collecting too much data and then end up running out of oomph to get it all done and written up. And so there are ones where sometimes you might leave things for post-PhD papers. Now, one of the other things I do is I work on a research methodology for doing your literature review. And this is called a systematic quantitative literature review method. And it's a really effective and powerful way. And doing this, you can have a short introduction, and then you have a first results chapter, which actually consists of a systematic quantitative literature review, which creates new knowledge. So what you do is you systematically search all the papers on a topic, you enter your data into a personal database, then you quantify what's known, but also, really importantly, what's unknown in the literature. So you're measuring where there are important key research gaps. So not only are they unknown, but it's really important that we do know them. That is where your research can fit. Now, there's a website with details about this. The easiest way is search Catherine Pickering Literature Review or attend one of the workshops at Griffith University. I do this. The website contains videos on how to do it, example papers doing it, papers on how to do it, and a whole lot of additional resource material. And there are now over 40 papers published using this method. And the videos, amazingly, which is why I'm doing more of them for you guys here, because it's such a useful way people are engaging with material, has been watched over 53,000 times. And there's this article in The Conversation. If you want to find out more, they're summarising this thing about knowing unknowns and knowns in research. So we've got to this, what do I suggest? So I've told you what the policy is, I've told you what the literature says. Well, what have I found works well with my students and also with other students within my area? Well, I suggest you have a statement in the introduction and final chapter about the structure. One of the things when you're putting a thesis together is managing expectations. So you're actually letting the reader know what the structure of the thesis is and why, and how it's is fitting university policy. I also think it's really important to include a conceptual model and structure diagrams in your introduction to let people understand how the thesis fits together. Then you can repeat that conceptual model in the final chapter, but now you're showing the results. Then the other things you need to have is paragraphs linking previous chapters to the next one. This is how about putting those papers, either PDFs and pre-publication, together in ways that shows how they work as papers, but also how they link together for that overall thesis. And that includes a statement about the publication and a statement about the student's contribution. So I'm going to go through examples of each of these. So in the introduction, I talk about having conceptual models. And this is one where it's both the structure and the concepts together. So in this case, the student's done a great job where he's got down the side here the different types of data that are being collected. And then in each chapter, he shows what data was collected in the chapters and how the whole overall structure fits both for the structure of the thesis, but also conceptually. Now that worked really, really well, but it doesn't, sometimes you can't do both a concept and structure in one diagram. So here's one where it's just the concepts showing you the major factors affecting a particular process, and the ones in bold are the ones that are going to be assessed in this thesis, or discussed in this thesis. And then there's a separate diagram showing how the structure of the thesis fits together, how the different chapters link to each other, to deal with jumping around in methodology, etc., but linking it between the introduction and the discussion. Now, I also talked about having an example statement about the thesis structure in the introduction. And not necessarily exactly these words, but this sort of information in the introduction is a good idea. This thesis consists of X chapters, a general introduction, chapter 1, and a final chapter here called the discussion, chapter 6, and 4 results chapters, chapters 2 to 5. Then it says the results chapters in the form of manuscripts formatted to meet the requirements of peer-reviewed academic journals that have been submitted to X journals. It might, this is where they've done it as the pre-publication version, or you could say these results chapters consist of the PDF. This is for the version going for examination of the papers. The thesis was done in accordance with Griffith University policy and reproduced the policy and an appendix, so the reader, the examiner, doesn't have to go and look up the policy. Just anything to make your life easier for the examiner is a good idea. As a result, there is some repetition amongst the results chapters, because one of the things that some people have a problem with is you might have repetition in your site methods, your site description methods, a little bit of the introduction. So say up front that that's there, but also why, and that it's consistent with the policy. So that's what that is really important. And make them be aware there'll be a reference list for each chapter. Then there are also detailed literature reviews at the start of each results chapter in accordance with the requirements of the journal manuscripts. So you can see here you're making sure they understand what's coming and why there will be that repetition. Then, so that's the introduction, the link, that statement to tell them about the structure and why, second in the introduction, and that conceptual diagrams. Then I talked about linking pages. So these go between each chapter. And the point about it is you use these to retrofit the individual chapters, results papers, back into the overall thesis by making it clear how they link together. So you have a section that says the previous chapter did X, blah, provided blah, blah, it found blah, blah. Then you say this results chapter therefore goes on to, and it specifically examines blah. So you're showing how, based on what you've already demonstrated and the person's just read, this is the next question or the next important point to look at. Then you need to have that information about the status of the publication. Chapter 2 is currently under review by the Journal of XX and has been formatted to meet the requirements of that journal style, or Chapter 2 has been published by blah, blah, and the citation is as follows, and you provide that. And then you need that third part, that's the statement about the contribution of the authors. So the authors of the manuscript are my thesis supervisors, blah, blah, blah. I contributed blah, blah to involve blah, blah, and blah, 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 and then signed by them. And the point about that is it makes it really clear what you did versus the other people, and they've signed off on that. Now, it can, as we mentioned, it can just be the corresponding author, but in some cases, the corresponding author for these papers is the student, and so it's requiring somebody, the other authors, to sign or sign. Sometimes you can get the principal other author to sign on behalf of the other authors if they've had authorisation from the other authors to do so. Now, the big debate against this, you say you've done really well, you've submitted all those papers and a whole lot of them have been accepted and they're now actually published and you've got the PDF format of them. Well, the big debate is, should I put the PDF of the paper or the Word version in to the version that goes to examination? So generally you can include the PDF version of the papers in the copy that's sent to examiners, but you may need to either remove the PDFs or put in the pre-review format or post-review Word version, depending on the copyright rules of the journal for the final version of the thesis that goes onto a university website, if it's published, because the journals often have copyright over the form of the paper in the PDF form, and in some cases they're also claiming copyright over the post-review version. Now, if you want to find out what a specific journal's requirements are around this, you can check out this website called Sherpa Ramoa website, and that tells you for all the journals exactly what the copyright requirements and rules are for that journal. Now, there are benefits and limitations. So this is about, if I use the PDF for published papers in the thesis, what are the benefits and limitations for the version going to examination and the online version? And then I've got it for the Word, if you use the Word version of the papers, either the pre-review or post-review, depending on the journal copyright. Okay, so let's work through this one first. You're going to put the PDFs. Why? Well, it can impress the examiners a lot. If they see the PDF, it psychologically said, this is in the format, in a journal, has been accepted. And it makes them often quite hesitant to request changes to it. Doesn't mean they don't have the right to, but it tends to make them be very cognizant that it's been through that review process, etc. But the downside is, like, you'll have to remove the PDF from the final version because of the copyright. For the online version, you have to remove the PDF for it depending on the copyright rules of the journal. And if so, either the online version doesn't provide access to all the information on the thesis. And what we tend to do there is you take out the PDF and put in a link to the journal website. Now, the downside is that that means that the thesis version is not the whole thesis for somebody to be able to access. But the good side of doing that sometimes is it may encourage citing of the papers rather than the thesis. Now, the point about this is I'm not saying do one or the other. What I'm saying is these are some of the issues you need to think about and discuss to work out what you want to do. If we go over here, using the Word version, well, consistency in formatting the thesis, including table of contents and figures, because that's a problem over here about having to have the tables numbered. Here you can have table 1.1, 1.2, chapter 2, table 1, 2.1, 2.2, etc. And they appear in the table of contents for figures, etc. But examiners may want changes to text despite including text based on published papers, and we've had that problem arise. And it's a little less authoritative compared to the PDF. But you get advantages when you get to this stage. The complete thesis is available for publication, depending on the copyright rules of the journal. Remember that pre- or post-publication copyright. But you still may have to remove it, depending on those rules. But it looks like a complete thesis in that format. Now, how to put together that final chapter. In my discipline area, we call it discussion chapter, and others it's conclusion. You need to know in different discipline areas how long it is, etc. But these are some ones that we work out that's really well. So you've done your chapters, results chapters, they've been accepted or are in review, and now you've put together those linking pages and that conceptual diagram, and you're putting together the thesis. Well, this is what I actually suggest as a structure for your final chapter. I suggest an introduction with a short summary of the importance of the topic, reinforcing to them why does this topic matter, plus a statement again that the thesis is done as papers and therefore there's been that repetition, and detailed discussions are available in each of the results chapters. And then make it clear. So this final chapter, the point of it is it synthesises all the papers in relation to the literature. So not each one of the chapters, but the chapters overall, to show an overall synthesis. And that's a really important point about what the discussion for one of these types of thesis can often be. Now, with this, there's a trick to it. When you've finished each of the papers, go back to the results papers, find the aims for each of the results chapters, look at them and say, okay, I'm going to combine them to 4 or 8 overall aims and put that in your introduction discussion. One of the most important things is it's not what you started out doing, it's what you've done. Make your aims what you've done and make sure that they're good aims and that's a worthwhile questions, but don't keep aims that you've no longer done or become less important as you did the research. Make it, what's the most important thing you found? What are the 3 or 4 most important things? They're the aims of your thesis now, because this is the body of research you've actually done and you're now presenting. So use those overall 4 to 8 overall aims and put them in the intro and final chapter so it is consistent. This is one of the big problems that people do, is they don't update their aims to what they've done. Don't promise you're going to do something you don't do, but also don't do something you haven't promised you're going to do in the thesis. Managing the examiner's expectations and reader's expectations, always important. Now, if you've done that with these overall 4 to 8 aims, after you've done this introduction bit, you go now and actually address them. And remember, the examiner reading this chapter for the first time won't have read the results chapters generally. They'll have read the abstract introduction and now they've come to the discussion. So what was aim 1? Answer the aim or question and link it to the existing literature. Aim 2, what was found and link it. Now these aims are aims that may apply across a couple of chapters, not just a single paper or chapter, but several of them. Some may only apply to one, but often they're broader themes. Do that for each of them. Then have a section with a heading, contribution to knowledge. In here, include the big picture thinking about the issue, expanding beyond the immediate results of the thesis. Examiners in the final chapter want you to do a bit of big blue sky thinking to demonstrate a broader context often for your thesis. The results chapters often have nice descriptive, more focused discussions. Here's where you can expand a bit on what does this overall mean for the discipline? Where's the discipline going? What's happened? So you're making these contribution to knowledge. The other thing is you've often made an important methodological contribution. So talk about the contribution to methods in the discipline, and often there are practical implications of your research. So have a section talking about what are the practical implications here for that. Then the final part, we suggest headings saying research context and further research directions. Now the research context is also where you highlight limitations. You can't do everything in a thesis, and it's really important for the examiner for you to acknowledge, but in a positive way, that there are important things that need still to be found out, that weren't able to be addressed, but are worthwhile. And so it's about those limitations, why they're there, but also where to go from there. So pointing out future research directions. How has the literature changed as a result of what you've found? What now would be the next key gaps for someone to address? Now, there's lots of training and support about writing papers. Your supervisors, and particularly in disciplines like science where there's often co-authorship, there's a lot of effort and involvement of supervisors, but also there are discipline-specific writing workshops, there are peer writing groups, there are books and articles on it, and there are often learning support units in universities. So there's a whole range of training to help you learn to write. Of course, some people get more input and more support and help in this, some have to do a lot more work to get that themselves. Varies with the student, varies with the supervisor, varies with the discipline area, varies with a whole lot of circumstances. I produced one about how to write ecology research papers. So that's there, it's available publicly, you can download that, and that's my ideas about how to learn how to write papers in ecology by going through existing papers and deconstructing them and looking at what do they put in the introduction, what do they put in the methods, what do they put in the results, discussion, etc. Working through example papers from journals like the ones you want to submit to show how, look at how they did it and then work on your own papers, getting an idea of how, not only reading a paper for its content, but for its structure and how it's been put together. So, finally, aim at resilience. Publishing can be hard, but it's worth it in the end. And good luck and happy publishing.